but I'd like to welcome you to this first session at the Battle of Ideas. My name's Tiffany Jenkins, and I'm going to be chairing it. The subject for discussion this morning is, are cultural boycotts killing artistic freedom? Cultural boycotts have been around for a long time. I can remember the attempt to boycott Paul Simon's Graceland in South Africa, which he refused to bow to and produce that wonderful album, Graceland. But they have resurfaced in the last few years, probably since around 2000, and I would say they're having a certain amount of effect. Just this year, you saw the successful campaign by Fossil Fuel Books divest the Baillie Gifford Prize funding from literature festivals across the country, including Edinburgh and Hay. So what we want to talk about this morning is that the case? Are they on the rise? Are they more effective? Why, if so? Is there a place for them? Are they either killing artistic freedom or an exercise of it? I've got a brilliant panel to discuss this with me. It's not a straightforward for and against. It's let's think about some of these issues in a bit more depth and complexity. The way it's going to work is that after I introduce them, they're each going to speak for about 5 minutes. I'll then throw it out open to you. You don't have to, like other conferences, conceal your point in a question. You can make a point. It's a conversation between you and us. So to begin, I'm going to ask Liette Rosenthal. She's currently the head of creative programs at Woolwich Works, and previously spent 10 years at Tate. She's now out on good behaviour, I think. Speaking after Liette, we'll have Professor Akhil Ahmed. He's the director of Amplify Consulting Limited, professor of media at the University of Bolton, and a former head of religion at Channel 4 and BBC. He also sits on the board, I think, of Bradford Literature Festival. We'll then hear from Denise Fahmy, who's the director of Freedom in the Arts and former Arts Council employee. And Freedom in the Arts, if you don't know, is a brilliant organisation that campaigns against cancellations in the arts and for artistic freedom. Speaking after Denise, we'll hear from Johnny Best, just arrived in an Uber from Euston. He's been up since 4, so treat him with kindness. He's an arts producer, festival director, and musician. And then we'll hear from Josh Howie, who is a comedian. He's the writer and star of Josh Howie's Losing It on BBC Radio 4, actor in Hapless, and a columnist for the Jewish Chronicle. Liette, if you'd like to begin.
Absolutely. So I always love the Battle of Ideas because everyone here is up for a good old debate. So in response to the provocation around, whether cultural boycotts are killing artistic freedom, I'll start with the no, which is that there is an area of artistic freedom for artists that is absolutely separate and very private and is very much free. So what artists do in the privacy of their own studios, what they create in their first drafts, in their sketchbooks, is very much for them. And that is something that a cultural boycott or current political discourse really doesn't need to intrude upon. And I think it is quite important to remember that. I'm always fascinated when I go to exhibitions and when you see a whole body of work of an artist over a lifetime, that there's work sometimes that they put out there, to the public, that's presented, displayed, but then there's also these kind of different strands of their work that sometimes they're producing concurrently, which is just very much for them, ideas that take years to develop. And I think a lot of artists talk about this, these sort of areas of their practice which are seeded and need a lot of time to bed in before they feel that they can be presented to the outside world. So on one hand, when we think about what artistic freedom is, it can be very separate from this very public world. And I think it kind of asks us to think quite deeply about what is art and who is the artist and what do artists do, and that kind of area of question. But obviously, once an artist's work meets the public, once it's in that wider arts ecology, it's a very different ballgame. And perhaps this argument is sort of the same as saying, you have the freedom to think what you want, but, you have to face the consequences when you say it out loud. There is that kind of part of what artists do. I wanted to touch a little bit on the cultural boycott and experiences of working within the arts sector and arts organisations, and perhaps what people don't really realise goes on when there are these big debates and these protests and all this complex political discourse, and the impact it has on arts organisations that are so very stretched, and the workforce is very well intended, but really struggle with the massive complexity of what's going on at the moment. But when there are these sort of crisis moments, the whole range of people involved is quite phenomenal. So you obviously have that brand and reputational damage, the press team get involved, the social media team get involved. There can be costs to operational staff, security, etc. And then there's also a very unseen cost, which is just around, people and how much those that work in the sector, when these, big political clashes come up and it affects the work that's programmed in their festival or their organisation, the sort of toll it takes on individuals working within those areas. And I think that's a bit that's slightly invisible. So I think sometimes when people join these boycotts, they don't really quite realise the sort of ripple effect. And it's this sort of ripple effect that I wanted to discuss a little bit today. I started up with some others, Artists Against Anti-Semitism UK, this year. What we do, what it's become is a very discreet what we're doing is very discreet and confidential conversations with artistic leaders to help them think through how they might face some of the challenges that have been taking place over the past year. One senior leader said, "We know that there's an issue with anti-Semitism, but we don't know what to do about it." Another said, "Everyone is so sensitive, we simply can't discuss anything." So what they're facing is not just sort of the boycott. It can be, low-level discriminatory behaviour. It could be just sort of a general culture or atmosphere where Jewish employees aren't feeling comfortable. But these things do intersect, so I think it's important to sort of tease those apart a bit. When working on launching Artists Against Anti-Semitism, we did a big survey and asked Jewish artists in the UK about their experiences. A lot felt that they were not comfortable anymore expressing parts of their Jewish identity, either within their work or just their views. And then there's this sort of wider ripple effect of boycotts. So we all know about these larger scale boycotts that go on in the sector. We read about them in the papers, and we kind of follow what's going on in the biennales and all these sort of larger scale events. But what might be less visible are these sort of smaller incidents of sort of cancellations which are impacted by these big boycotts. So, for example, a smaller venue that just doesn't want to take a risk on presenting work with Jewish content at this point in time. So this is perhaps work there's nothing to do with the conflict, nothing to do with the Middle East, not an Israeli artist, nothing at all, just the experience of Jewish artists or creating work with Jewish content in the UK now. And I think there's also a case to be made and for us to discuss about, the boycott and actually reversing that and thinking actually, artists who are making work in places of conflict should actually be platformed and as a priority. And this is a provocation for us to discuss. But, these are individuals who are usually, struggling to have their work funded, supported, platformed, and also sometimes the most critical voices of their government, and also sometimes the most hopeful voices for what could be in the future. So I think that's an interesting area to discuss as well. I wanted to sort of close on a quote, which is from an artist who said, "The arts is a place where these conversations circle around all the time, about politics, about boycotts, who's in, who's out. And they're going on, sometimes they feel like they're going on across my head or above me as I'm working in my studio. I'm not necessarily involved in them, and I just sort of sit in my studio and focus on my pigments and techniques. And I think it is important to just say that the artistic processes sometimes are just feel for the artists themselves quite far removed from what we're talking about here. So to conclude, my concluding thought is just it's an incredibly important conversation to have around boycotts and artistic freedom. And I do wonder whether currently the arts sector is the place where it's best place to actually have those conversations.
Thank you. Akil.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm caught in the middle, probably like a lot of people. I think you have to have the right to protest, and at the same time, you have to have the ability to be able to book and hear and speak with anybody you want as well. But like was just mentioned, you also have a responsibility. Being able to do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it in the first place as well, or actually how you do it. It's not about can you do something. It's more about should you, would you, could you? Is it right for the right audience? Is there and all of those kind of things. Now, as somebody who spent most of their career in television, I've worked with a lot of people that I couldn't bloody stand, quite frankly, and if I'm honest with you, a lot of them couldn't stand me. And when I became the head of religion, I had to shake the hands and sign the contracts for people who wrote some pretty horrible, racist things about me in the press before I got the job. It's part of the game, right? You can't effectively your own prejudices or your own beliefs or your own things are actually have to be left at the door when you decide that you're going to be curating something, whether it be a TV, radio program, a literature festival, an arts cultural event. You should be professional. And that's one of the things I just wanted to have a conversation about today, which is I'm going to personalize it a little bit and say these are my particular opinions and my views and experience of working in this territory, and it may not necessarily be what everybody can deliver, but actually I think you don't necessarily have to have a problem with boycotts. Sometimes it can depend on how you approach a subject. And I go back to the whole just the TV thing, and it's quite a similar thing, which is I remember once being invited to I had to go and give a talk to the Danish Union of Journalists. They wanted to know that in the programs that I'd made, which had been quite full on, in the life of Muhammad and the Quran, etc. We talked about whether or not the Mecca existed in the first place. Is the Quran read in the right language? Is Muhammad a paedophile? All the kind of key subjects that you would expect to interrogate, or we're told we're never allowed to talk about, but these were primetime award-winning documentaries, so you can talk about them, but you just if you're open-minded enough. And they wanted to know why we won awards for this rather than have death threats. And my whole point was, well, if you set out to offend, why are you surprised when people are offended? But if you offend in the process of trying to tell a particular or explain a subject, then people generally are not as offended as much as when you say, it's my right to offend you, so therefore I'm going to offend you. I'm not making a judgment on whether or not that's right or wrong, but I'm just simply saying the ability to say and do something sometimes doesn't necessarily mean you should do it. Now, with regards to when you're doing the literature, if you're in charge of any particular kind of event like this, you have to make decisions. And we've had people pull out, or we've had conversations about boycotts, we've had little mini things. But I think there's quite an interesting thing that we have, which is we've never really had the problems that other festivals have had. And I'm not here speaking on behalf of the Bradford Literature Festival, but you probably don't realise it's one of the largest literature festivals in the country. It's in the top 3, right? And people don't realise that, because I didn't realise that when they asked me to get involved. My prejudice of coming from Manchester was Bradford. Yeah, right. Yeah? It really was. And I went there, I was blown away. We're talking 500 to 700 events. It's the most diverse, mainstream literature festival in the country. And we have a creative director who is an inspiration in this, but also has the values and lives the values. The festival has particular kind of values. So what we're not talking about here is bandwagon jumping or being hit by something which suddenly affects you, because it all depends on what are the values of the particular organisation or the event that you're running. And I think that's the thing that we often forget to talk about. We talk about, these poor people have been there's a boycott going on and it's because of fossil fuels or whatever it may be, but the fact of the matter is if you're setting yourself out to be a particular kind of thing, and you take money from organisations which may not necessarily sit with the values of maybe a lot of your audience, then it's something for you to think about. Now, we think about that quite a lot in our particular festival, and we have relationships and credibility, and I think that relationships and credibility factor is key. So when we have had conversations, as we had to have this summer, with people who wanted to know whether or not Where were we getting our funding from? We were getting funding from some of the same organisations that had major boycotts. The relationship that we have in terms of based on people respecting and actually knowing that we have a particular kind of mindset and we do things, and we've been doing things for a decade in a certain kind of way, and we have this kind of integrity. When we had those conversations, we didn't have this major pullout that everybody else had. If people decided not to come, they decided not to come and had a polite conversation and said, we'll not be coming this year, but we'll pick this up next year. We've had people pull out in the past, and we've then had that similar conversation when there was an attempt at a bit of a boycott a few years ago over taking money from the Home Office. And then once we explained was, and one of the key things here is about funding, is to actually explain to people, this is the territory we're in. There's no money. People aren't fighting over themselves to give millions of pounds to Bradford.
Yeah.
Right? Actually, they are now, but not from here, not in this country. People abroad see the benefit of one of the youngest demographics in the country and a culturally diverse one, et cetera, et cetera. So they're coming in. But the fact of the matter is that when you explain to them and say, tell you what, they gave us £300,000 and we spent that money on hard-to-reach groups to get them to come to engage with literature. That's whether it be Roma, young white men, Asian women of a certain age, et cetera, whatever it was, that was what the money was for. So now tell me, are you going to give us 300 grand to do that work? Or any of you and your mates going to do it? You're not, are you? So that's what I'm saying. So thankfully, if you have that kind of relationship, you can then offset it. Now, I've probably waffled on a little bit, and there's a few more things I'd like to talk about. They may come out later on. But that's the key thing I wanted to leave us with, which is actually how do people perceive you? And that's, I often think, the problem that people have later on when it comes to hit them later on. They don't realise what they're doing. The work that I've done with the Welsh in Wales, mixing up things like outreach and cultural literacy work and all decolonisation. There's so many kind of like things which people get wrong, and people always get them wrong because they don't necessarily come at this with the right kind of values and live by those values all year round. So I'll leave it at that because I know I've waffled on a little bit, but hopefully we can pick up on some other things that I run out of time on.
Thank you. Denise.
I admire my fellow panellists that can read so eloquently from their heads, but I'm afraid I'm just going to use my laptop and use the screen. Very boring of me. So the first thing I want to say is that cultural boycotts are not ever going to go away. They're going to carry on. And art is inherently about opinion. Making art is in and of itself an act of manifesting a thought in a non-sequential way, possibly not even understandable, possibly abstract. It's a complex process, and it also demands consideration in the public consciousness. So just following on a little from what Liat was saying about the experience of being an artist, artists have exhibitions because they are exhibitionists. Being an exhibitionist is both a terrifying and liberating experience. To be an artist is to put your inner life on show, open to scrutiny, criticism, failure, ridicule, and to do it for your whole life, even perhaps past the time you're a bit fed up with it, doing it, to be honest, but at some point in your career, there's no going back. You have to carry on. Believe it or not, being an artist is actually a courageous act. I mean, I'm not overstating it. On a scale of 1 to 10 of bravery in the workplace, perhaps it's a few points higher than opening the office in the morning, but significantly less than militarily serving your country. But still, there is bravery in putting yourself out there. Let me just see how the screen moves. So the arts as a profession has that bravery at its heart. And so, understandably, there's a cravenness in the way that the profession functions. No one, including me, wants to be the person who says to the exhibiting artist, to be honest, I don't think that work was very good. None of us want to say that. But having said that, the art world is also very vicious. It's a small world. It's highly competitive. The flow of cash is unpredictable, and it's subject to fashion in aesthetics, politics, and people. So scrambling to the top of your profession, like many professions, is as much down to your staying power in difficult circumstances as it is to your talent. At the same time, it's hard to talk about art. Like, it's hard to talk about dreams.
Having worked at a national arts funding agency for many years, applicants would rightly ask, how do funders judge artistic quality? How do they do it in writing? Well, it's actually far easier to talk about, to write about values, mission, purpose, politics, than it is to talk about art. So it's in this workplace, amongst the world's greatest exhibitionists, that a political position in the public square is not only inevitable, even if, frankly, you don't know much about the subject and it doesn't even affect you, it's not only inevitable, it's actually expected. Cultural boycotts are not going to go away, and there are times when we all, as individuals, as gallery visitors, might well decide, no, I'm not going to see that because the politics, the background of the show, or the artist, it's not my thing. I have some sympathy with people who turn out to protest at artist Carl André's retrospectives. André, you'll remember, is notorious for the pile of brick sculptures purchased by the Tate in the mid-70s. But he was also heavily implicated in the death of his wife, Anna Mendieta, who fell from their 34th floor apartment in 1985 in suspicious circumstances. Having said that, I really love Caravaggio. And as you may know, he's got a bit of a checkered past too. So what about now? There's no denying that arts are struggling with a boycott and a censure mindset. Wrongthink is omnipresent. The only way forward, in my view, is the delineation between the individual and the institution. Individuals, artists, visitors, activists can exercise freedom of thought. They can exercise freedom of association, expression, the right to walk out. But institutions, and I'm going to use an unpleasant phrase, Tiffany, institutions must man up. That was the unpleasant phrase. I was going to use a worse one, actually, but I took it out. Right. They must protect the public square for all to express themselves. If they don't, yes, we will kill art. What is the point of artists bearing their soul if institutions will throw them under the bus at the first sniff or even rumour of a complaint? And we know that a rumour of a complaint is enough, not a complaint, is enough to see you cancelled. And institutions must publish this commitment. They must do this publicly, not just mutter it at board meetings or in the odd op-ed that they publish. They need to publish in their website everywhere that they will protect artists saying what they want to do, what they want to make, what they want to present. There's another thing that's going to kill art, and that is politicisation of curation. The urge, the obsession to make exhibitions about politics, about curators' politics, and not about art, not only about the art. Hang on, I've lost my saying. Yes, so this obsession to talk about politics in curation, as curators, to be, in a way, cultural politicians, is killing art because it's another way of a craving platforming of their own ideas rather than reflecting the art that's actually being made. It would be nice to see a few shows that have aesthetics, imagination, craft, expertise, whimsy, humour at their core, rather than just politics.
Thank you. I like your use of whimsy.
Whimsy.
A little bit more whimsy. Johnny.
Thank you. Hi. Oh, sorry. I've worked in the arts all my life since I was 18, really, beginning as a pianist in musical theatre, playing in pit orchestras, going into theatre and opera, then spending 12 or 13 years leading arts festivals. Now I work in silent film, a niche within a niche. Yes, my parents are so proud. But when I led a festival in Manchester called Queer Up North, and I led it for 4 or 5 years. And in 2008, 16 years ago, we were subject to a protest, a noisy but small protest of trans activists who wrote to me demanding that I cancel an American singer, an American lesbian singer, who they deemed transphobic. I wrote back and refused, The protest took place on the day. They gathered outside, and I went out to speak to them, and the event happened. And my board, the charitable trustees, were absolutely standing by me. I mean, we talked about it for no more than 5 minutes. You know, it was like, well, you know, there was no question that we would be cancelling, that we would not be cancelling the event. And I think, and now, 16 years later, it wouldn't be so simple. It probably wouldn't be so simple. And we've got examples of many examples. I mean, perhaps the most egregious is Rosie Kay's experience with her board for her, her previous dance company. So something's changed, and I agree with much of what's been said already. I won't repeat it. I would like to pick up on one thing that Denise said and just develop that a bit further. I don't think the problem isn't the artists who are protesting. It's not those who try to initiate boycotts. That's always happened, and it always will. And the freedom to withhold your artistic labour, the freedom even to seek to persuade others to do the same, to act politically, even if I might think the politics is narcissistic or ignorant. The freedom to act politically is part of artistic freedom. So the problem is one of leadership in the arts. It's an arts and cultural leadership issue, because too often CEOs, managers, boards capitulate in the face of protest and boycott, and sometimes they do it almost preemptively because they're so concerned about brand damage, and that's the problem. Free expression, artistic freedom, it's just a dimension of free expression, is seen in the arts as a matter, it's not seen as a positive value. It's seen as a set of issues that are to do with reputation preservation, to do with protecting the brand. Arts Council sees it almost entirely in this way. All of the resources it produces are about what do you do if your organisation is subject to some kind of protest or boycott. How do you protect your reputation? They have no interest at all in the positive virtue of artistic freedom. And there are, and I think this is the problem. My personal view is that if you're leading an arts organisation, then artistic freedom as a principle should be part of understanding it and preserving it, protecting it, should be a core part of your job. And institutions dedicated to some kind of artistic production. When we talk about arts and artists, I'm talking about writers, musicians, actors, dancers, filmmakers, the widest possible conception. Artistic freedom should be seen by arts organisations and by leaders in the arts in the same way that academic freedom should be seen by academics and institutions of higher learning. It should just run through everything we do as a positive value. But we're a long, long way away from that. As well as Arts Council, another organisation that's failing in this respect is the CLAW Leadership Programme, which is 21 years old this year. And I must disclose, I'm a CLAW Fellow. I was a 2010 cohort. The CLAW Leadership Programme, co-founded by Vivian Duffield, an important philanthropist in the arts, was established to improve the quality of cultural leadership in the United Kingdom. And CLAW Fellows are all over the arts now. They pretty much dominate in leadership positions across the arts. But CLAW has done nothing to address the issue of artistic freedom, which I think is a terrible shame. And as the idea that we should all be activists has spread through the arts, fostered by organisations like Arts Council and CLAW and many, many others, the space for artistic freedom continues to shrink. And my view is that if you lead an arts organisation, if you call yourself a cultural leader, then your job is to identify that space of artistic freedom, to protect it, to seek to expand it, to advocate for it. And I think if we're not doing that as arts and cultural leaders, then we're not doing our job.
Thank you, Johnny, and thank you to our panel. Let's give them a round of applause. Oh.
Going home. I've been boycotted.
Sorry, Josh. Josh.
No, fuck you. No.
He's delivered his best one.
So, yeah, I think I'm somewhat at an interesting crossroads here in terms of this debate. As a comic, or I wouldn't say artist, but sometimes if I'm lucky, I get to that point. As a comic of 23 years, as a activist fighting anti-Semitism, predominantly from the left, but also from the right over the last 8 years or so. And as someone who has been boycotted myself, boycotted last year, various people trying to get gigs of mine cancelled because this was when the bombing of the hospital happened, and then it turns out, there were supposedly 500 people killed. Turns out there wasn't. It was a car park. It was also bombed by Islamic Jihad. And I'd made a comment at the time calling it out, and some people were disgusted and were calling around gigs and trying to get these cancelled. There's also a different kind of boycott with my BBC, my Radio 4 series has been pulled from the Sounds app. I believe, I just noticed it the other day, and I don't believe it's any coincidence that I've been calling out BBC News for, I believe, to be their anti-Semitism. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is also that I'm somewhat angry in all of these roles that I have. So I'm trying to sort of contain that anger and put it into some sort of coherent thought. The three dynamics I see at play here, of course, are the artists and their art. You have the audience, the people who are going to absorb it, and then, of course, you have the gatekeepers. And the gatekeepers could be the cultural festivals, could be the book publishers, could be the comedy venues, and that seems to be the dynamic that exists between the two. Starting with the first one, with artists, and going back to the question of this debate, or talk, cultural boycotts, are they killing artistic freedom? And in the long term, I think no. I think art will always rise accordingly, whether there's an audience or not. Obviously, with stand-up comedy, arguably, you need an audience. Thank you for turning up. But I still think that the reason why genuine artists make art is less maybe to make other people do it for other people. They do it for themselves. And what certainly what I feel is someone who has an unwillingness, or not even unwillingness, an inability to do anything different. The jokes I write are the jokes that make me funny, and I can't really write any other way. So I think that's going to spread across all the different art forms. In the short term, there obviously is going to be issues here with these cultural boycotts, because I think expressed in two ways. One is through quality, and what I'm talking about here is for the, there's the people at the top of their medium, and then there's a lot of people who are sort of okay or good or very good, and maybe I'm sort of good and sometimes very good. But the point is that financially there are going to be ramifications in terms of the gigs that I've lost, the people who won't book me now because of being on GB News or because of being outspoken about anti-Semitism, and that has a short-term impact, of course, in whether you can even continue with what you do. Saying all of that, it really then comes down to how hard are you willing to work? And there are people who have managed to skip outside of the traditional gatekeeper system. And, you've got Andrew Gold, who was making documentaries. He's got his own Heretics podcast that's doing very well now. So if you're willing to work really hard, you can overcome these boycotts. I'm not willing to work that hard. That's my problem. Also, of course, being boycotted can even help you. You had Jess DeWalls, who her embroidery was pulled from the the British Royal Academy, yeah. And then that in itself, she sold a lot of work through that attention. That doesn't mean she wasn't cancelled or whatever, but these new models will exist. And also in literature, you're seeing Jewish authors supposedly not being able to get any work commissioned, but just by having Jewish names, or publishers just not wanting the hassle of it. And you will see in the long term new publishing houses rise to deal with that. That's the way that it's always been. Again, I'm not the one who's going to actually be doing that. But long term, I believe that work will get out there. Going to the next part of the relationship, the audience, I think they're going to see a decline. I think we've seen that decline happen just in the comedy world. And I think of what was the beacon of the comedy circuit, the Comedy Store, the Standard just has gotten worse. Now that is partly through booking, and that's partly through a bit of self-policing from mediocre comics. But what's going to happen then, of course, is the audience are going to vote with their feet. And speaks to the commercialization of art. But audiences want authenticity, they want quality, and they'll go elsewhere. And you have other comedy clubs that will come up and take that role. The final part of that equation is the one that I know probably the least about in terms of the gatekeepers element of it. I want to say something that was in the bump that was on the website. There was this sort of, I believe, a false equivalence between people boycotting festivals because of Israel on one side or the other. I believe what I've seen, people boycotting and boycotting of Jewish authors is because of their ethnicity. And I think that there was this sort of then what about pro-Palestinians being boycotted? But from what I've seen of those, and I'm not arguing for the boycott, but I'm saying that one side is being boycotted for the inherent characteristic of who they are, and the other side, if they are pro-Palestinian, have been boycotted because of racism. And those are two different things. I don't want them to be put on the same sort of pedestal, like one or the other. And with Hay Festival, you had Julie Finch. She said her priority is the artist and the audience. And then that's when she sort of turned down the funding from Bailey Gifford, which I think is just the stupidest fucking comment ever. I think she's a fucking idiot. And frankly, she betrayed her job. I don't expect to be booked soon. Fortunately, like I said, I'm too lazy to actually write a book, so I'm not too worried. But that is, and I think to mirror quickly what various people have said here, I sort of see the gatekeepers as the adults in the room, and I feel like most of them haven't been doing their job. And I want to naively go back to a time when art was chosen because of it was good. You know, could we please do that?
Let's thank our panel. It was a very useful excavation of the problem, I think. It'd be interesting to find out what you think. We've got a lady down here. Can we have the microphones? If you bring the microphone here, and keep your hands up so I can see you. I'll take a group, and then we'll come back to the plan.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Geraldine Murphy. I'm a Colchester mum or Colch mum on X. Come find me. I've got possibly the worst cancellation story. I think I could top everyone's. I want to talk about Arts Council England, okay, and their rules in this. I know, Denise, you've had some dealings with them before. I'm very familiar with that. They funded a show at my local theatre, which is Mercury Theatre Colchester, last year, and it was a show by a band called Dream Nails, a band that records sexually explicit content and incites violence towards women. Their most famous song includes the line, "Kick turfs all day, don't break a sweat." They made the headlines when they were played on the BBC when Roisin Murphy was cancelled. Do you remember that? What the BBC said was people will interpret anything with an element of nuance and ambiguity differently. Does anybody remember that? My daughter went to a show at the Mercury Theatre by that band. I didn't find out until later what that band were all about, when I read about what they said. When I wrote into the theatre, Arts Council England helped them write the response. They'd funded the show with £30,000 of our money to record a sexually explicit album and tour it to children around the east of England. My daughter went to a children's show there where they played that. They listened to songs about lesbian porn and about what goes in and out of a man's vagina. Okay, I'm not joking. This is serious. Okay, when I wrote in and complained about it, Arts Council England helped them write the response. And do you know what they did? They quoted the BBC. Yeah, they said people will interpret things with an element of ambiguity. So it didn't stop there, okay? So they told me that. This is the board. They told me that. They told me it was, obviously I'm just missing something, that element of nuance and ambiguity. It didn't stop there, okay? I'm a customer. I'm also a taxpayer, yeah? Women pay taxes too, remember? Yeah? And it didn't stop there. They discriminated against me in applying their complaints policy. They refused me an appeal. I asked them to consider no incitement to violence policy about anyone. They ignored it. Okay, this went back and forth for a long time. They went from discriminating against me to victimisation. Under the law, that's victimisation when they apply their... Then it went to intimidation. I'll skip over that bit. Then it went to harassment. Last time I went into the theatre, I was followed around and I was harassed. I've got this on video. I posted it online. I posted a photo of myself online, which was then used to arrest me. They had me arrested after that. Yeah? They had me arrested. That's the chief executive, the chair, 2 trustees, and 2 senior members of staff conspired to have me arrested for harassment because I tweet about violence against women and girls and I tweet about safeguarding. They conspired to have me arrested for harassment and criminal damage. I had my house searched. I had my DNA taken. I was taken into custody for several hours. I've been on bail for the last 2 months. The police took my phone. I wasn't allowed in a whole area of my city for all that time. I reported for bail yesterday. Okay? All allegations of harassment dropped. The CPS saw it for the conspiracy it was. All allegations of criminal damage dropped. There was no criminal damage. I've never stickered in my life. How did they get it down to me? There were 400 people in the theatre at that time. It was the election hustings. So this is kind of an extreme example, I would say. The irony is, they got me on one thing, malicious communications. I made a big mistake. I'm usually very careful what I tweet, but I made a big mistake. I tweeted a doctored image of one of the trustees, one of the ones who's had me arrested, holding up a piece of paper saying, "Kick TERFs all day." This man works in a domestic violence shelter, by the way. And I got done for malicious communications, had to accept a caution. I've now got a criminal record for life, which ironically means I may not be able to work with children. These men don't want me safeguarding children. I saw on the exhibit, I saw on the exhibit yesterday what the man had written, and he'd written it was a picture of him holding up something with offensive wording on. That's the same man that told me it was nuanced and ambiguous a few months ago, and now I've got to write him an apology. And that's all I have to say, but Arts Council England, I've got their hands all over it. They've stood by and watched while this has all happened, and that's my story. So follow me on Twitter, Coach Mum. Thanks.
There's a lady down here.
Hello, Claudia Clare. I'm not sure I can really follow that. That was... for what it's worth, I was just going to, also address, I think it was Johnny made the point, but in some ways obliquely you all did, about institutional failure. But in 2011 I wrote an article for Ceramic Review about the growing censorship in the arts. I did it because for the first time I had had work removed from an exhibition that was planned for Keighley Castle, part of the Bradford Metropolitan Museums and Galleries. And it was, in a sense, preemptively removed. The exhibition was still planned. It was going to start in 30 days. It had been planned for 2 years, right? And I argued and I got the piece reinstated because I pointed out they had included an image of that pot in the publicity. I'm a potter, or at least I was. I was a potter then, and these were very big pots. Okay, so I rang around every curator I knew at every museum and gallery that I knew, not any support from any one of them, apart from Nima Purvaya Smith, by the way, who really did stand up for me, and she was based in Bradford then, I think still is. But I then asked the editor of Ceramic Review if I could write an article about all this and the issue of censorship generally and what was happening. Yes, she agreed, and I did, and it was published. Go forward, 12 years from that, and actually that same organisation, which is Craft Potters Association, Ceramic Review, they're all the same organisation. They expelled me from Ceramic Art London, both me and my work from Ceramic Art London, for having the wrong ideas. So there's a change there, very noticeable one, that took place over 12 years. But in the course of writing that article, I then again rang round every museum and asked them, that I could find a phone number for, asked them if they had a commitment to the right to free expression, or if they had any comment, statement about it anywhere. Not one single one did. And pretty well none of them understood what purpose it would even serve. And to the best of my knowledge, that has never changed. I think that's well worth knowing.
Thank you. Can we see who else wants to speak? Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll take a couple more and then we'll come back. There's a gentleman there with glasses. If you could go next, sir.
So I was just thinking about the funding of the arts. I mean, so first of all, it strikes me that much of the funding for art actually comes from the private sector. And I don't really want to speak about that, but I'm interested in, this issue of how sponsors, like the kind of brand dimensions of art, of sponsorship, and how that works in relation to cancellation. That seems to me to be quite important in this conversation. But I just wanted to speak about public funding. I mean, it seems to me, in particular, the policies of the Arts Council. There is nothing that can be done except for kind of for a political conversation at a national level to shift the policies and priorities of the Arts Council in relation to these cultural questions. That seems to me to be one thing. I think the BBC similarly, but that's a different point. But what I wanted to kind of say mostly is that the question of freedom of artists to express themselves, the greater distance that we can place between the kind of the exigencies of funding and the exigencies of policies and the practice of artists, then so much the better. So I've spent some time, in the artist studio sector, and the short-term character of the availability of spaces and the kind of funding and the priorities of sponsors becomes really important in shaping artistic output. And the more that you can have really long-term, free or low-cost space, which is not dependent on the political imagination or the kind of creative imagination of sponsors, the better. So it seems to me that's where we need to get to in policy terms.
Hey, I'm going to take that gentleman there. If you could take the microphone to the back, we'll then listen to him. Then a couple of words from the panel to come back. Really the most important things you think. You can't respond to everybody, but what do you think is the main thing you'd like to say to some of these points? And then we'll go back out. So you, and then panel.
Yeah, hi. Simon Evans, I'm a stand-up and a colleague of Josh's at GB News. I missed the first sort of 5 or 10 minutes, so forgive me if I'm going over old ground. I do think that like cultural boycotts of festivals sponsored by Baillie Gifford, for instance, absolutely infuriating. Most of the people who withdrew from those festivals because they felt that they wanted to be seen to ally with that cause were people who had secondary sources of income or wealth or were established enough to be able to do so without experiencing significant harm, and the attempt to conflate the arming of Israel with fossil fuels and other investment that Baillie Gifford were involved with. I just found it absolutely infuriating to be slimed with them. But having said that, I'm also aware that this is not a new phenomenon. We're treating it as if we're encountering some kind of meteorological event for the very first time, as if this is a hurricane that has never been seen before making landfall on the arts. I read a book a few years ago called Cultural Amnesia by Clive James, which was a sort of collection of various marginalia and thoughts he'd had while reading many of the world's great thinkers, whether literary or philosophy or so on, in the 20th century. And the underlying theme, broadly speaking, which emerged, I don't think he ever really stated it explicitly, but it was definitely there, was how they had responded to the great issues of the 20th century, namely the emergence of various totalitarian states in the mid-20th century, and those who had written under Soviet occupation, those who had confronted Nazism or fled from it in order to be able to write freely about it, and so on. And he was writing that in the 1990s at a point at which he felt that those issues had been resolved, and we all now enjoyed a certain amount of sort of warm bath of artistic freedom, and thankfully everyone was at peace now, and the end of history and so on. Well, clearly those things will never happen. But artists have always had to struggle. They've always had to confront the fact that there probably isn't consensus for their views and that there will be people trying to shut them down. However infuriating the Bailey Gifford boycotts and so on are, they're nothing compared to the challenges which many artists who left behind really memorable work in the 20th century had to ignore, basically, in order to carry on. And we do actually, I think, very often sharpen ourselves against the whetstone of such hostility. So I would just say there's no reason to give up hope just yet.
So artists should man up too. There's a gentleman there, then the panel, then I'll come back out to you.
Oh, hello. So I'm not involved in the arts as a performer. I did once interview a controller of Radio 3 in his office at Broadcasting House, and he had a great big Soviet propaganda poster on the wall, and I sat there thinking, what on earth would the reaction be if that was a Nazi poster? I mean, the BBC's hopelessly compromised. The lady who spoke first, very, very movingly about her experience of the BBC. I had a tiny little one similarly. I once complained to BBC News about a report on a conference of the United Kingdom Independence Party that described Nigel Farage as, quote, rabble-rousing the faithful in his speech. And I got an answer back that said, oh, it's okay, that's right, pretty fair, no problem with that. But the question I wanted to ask simply to Akhil, you said, generally, if people don't set out to say, I want to offend, I have a right to offend, people won't take offence. I think that's probably a bit of wishful thinking there. I mean, did the teacher in Barnsley who showed a photograph of the Prophet Muhammad to his pupils, having told them that, that if they didn't want to look, they could leave the room. Did he set out to offend? The truth is there are an awful lot of people out there who want to take offence, and they're not really going to be bothered if people do or do not say they aren't bothered about giving offence.
Okay, I want to come back to the panel. Akhil, can I come to you first?
Yeah, I mean, I did make the point it was quite personal, and I'm not going to go into that particular case, but the fact of the matter is, I just look at the programmes that I've made, and I mentioned some of the things that we said, and they were bloody offensive, yeah? Really offensive. So I'm just saying, that's just my take on it. Whether you like it or not, you don't have to agree with it. I won't be offended if you don't agree with what I'm saying. But the fact of the matter is, if you make a programme that says Mecca didn't exist, if you say that the Quran is read in the wrong language, that Muhammad may be you have people debating those kind of that subject territory, and it's at 9 p.m. on the BBC, or previously we did the similar thing at 9 p.m. on Channel 4, and it was sold all around the world. These programs were sold all around the world, shown on Discovery Channel, whatever, you name it. I'm just trying to say, things do exist, right? It's not monocultural. You can't just say all these things don't happen. Things that might happen, like the one in Batley, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about how I made it quite clear what I think. And I think it goes back to some of the things we talked about here as well, which is, my point of view is that for some time, it's not always 100%, but sometimes if you have a particular level of integrity, or if you have a reputation, or if you have a value system that you live by all year round, then you can have a better conversation than if you basically will take money from absolutely everybody, and that way then when the complaints do come in, you haven't got a leg to stand on because you've not got any particular value system that you can fall back on. So when you do turn around and say, we're here to protect our audiences or whatever it may be, the fact of the matter is you didn't care when you were pigs at the trough trying to get as much money as you could from whoever you wanted to get it from. So have a value set system, and then you can basically judge where you get your money from and what benefit that has to the audiences and to the performers.
Is it cultural value or political value?
It can be anything. can be anything. Culture, politics, all these things merge into one. But it's actually what's your values for what you're going to be doing. So I could use an example. This year we had to make a decision on some complaints that had been made about us silencing some Palestinian voices. We also had we made it quite clear to one person who got in touch with me. I said, well, we're not silencing it very well if we've got a whole 1.5 hour in conversation with the ambassador. And then they just laugh and they go, yeah, fair enough. And that's the end of it. So the fact of the matter is it could have piled on, but it didn't because we had something to go back to. And I think half the time people have nothing to go back to because it's a complete scattergun approach because we're so desperate for funding, you'll take money from absolutely everywhere. And then when it all unravels, you've got nothing to fall back on. That's my point, is actually always have something to fall back on and live by those values all year round.
Johnny?
Just a quick response to this, advocating that arts organisations should have values. Now, it's a commonplace idea today, and I understand what you mean, but I would also point out that it is this having values which has often led to artistic freedom being shrunk. Claudia Clare is nodding down there because, Claudia, you had your exhibition cancelled by, no, it was big. Yeah, because you had an exhibition cancelled because your work did not align with the values of the gallery. So I think the issue of values is a complex one, exactly, because values are used as a way to shrink the space for artistic freedom. And in particular, that has happened to gender-critical women over the last few years who have routinely been told your belief that sex is real and exists does not align with our values, with our commitment to diversity. So values are not a straightforward, unalloyed good in this area, I think.
Does anybody else want to say anything on the panel?
I'm just curious about Professor Ahmed. When did those TV shows go out?
In the last decade.
I just wonder if you made a show now about whether Mohammed was a paedophile.
Oh, believe me, you couldn't make it then. Believe me, I know you're trying to go, but you're miles away from the reality. You couldn't make it then. Actually, the bigger thing is now you wouldn't make it now because they wouldn't commission it because they wouldn't think they'd get an audience.
They wouldn't think they'd get an audience.
It wouldn't be commissioned now because they wouldn't think they'd get an audience, not because anybody would be terrified, but they weren't terrified. Believe me, we were terrified then. We spent more money on probably protecting BBC buildings around the world than we did on actually making the series. Yeah.
No, I appreciate your point that there is tact and diplomacy and an art to this, but do you recognise what most people feel, which is that there's been a shrinking of what is possible?
Oh,
so
God,
there's a sort of almost a preemptive self-boycott.
Yeah, well, actually, I had written that in my kind of like blurb earlier on. Actually, I think often we self-censor and we self-boycott more than anything. And I think a lot of it is actually, it's really hard to, I mean, when you're commissioning subjects, whether it be for TV or for a festival or for whatever, you've also got to think about who's your core audience. And I think that's and audiences shift over time. The audience that we had in the numbers that we had when we commissioned those programs to build on that particular comment doesn't exist now. You know, getting 1.5 million, 2 million viewers for a documentary at 9 p.m., forget it. If you get 200,000 or 300,000, it's a result now. So the audience has changed. It's gone all over the place. And it's the same thing with when you decide what subject matter. So with the organisations that I've been involved in the last few years, you know, we won't shy away from debating any particular kind of subject, but that's because of who we are. So when I use the word values, I don't mean something like, you know, this is our values, you can look at it on the website. It's just about how you behave, and having consistency is probably a better word than values, having some kind of consistency. We have a particular level of consistency, so the audience that comes, they know what they're going to get. If you have an audience that isn't prepared for the kind of some of the conversations that you're about to have, then that's when it can become more difficult. So yeah, we're always making choices, and you're right, but audiences shift. And funding shifts and all of those kind of things shift. So trying to compare something that happened to 20 or 30 years ago is quite difficult because that audience and that mechanism for broadcast or for people going to watch something or to attend an event is very different than what it was 20 or 30 years ago.
Denise?
But good things are also happening.
Always will.
We've set up our organisation, and that's brilliant, Freedom in the Arts. And I think I think the gentleman asked, how do we change things? It's pressure. It's just ongoing pressure, and keep bringing this stories to light, keep, I was going to say, keep harassing the funders, you know, but it's a pressure group has to apply pressure, basically, and it's ongoing. And, you know, we are seeing a few changes. You know, for the first time in August, the chair of the Arts Council actually wrote about artistic freedom in The Observer. I mean, he got the wrong end of the stick, and we corrected him, luckily, because they published our letter.
Didn't understand
but
it.
He didn't quite get it, but...
Glass half full.
Glass half full.
Yeah.
He would not have done that even a year ago.
No.
You know, so that was a step forward. And yesterday, or the day before, we saw Index on Censorship actually defend on Twitter LGBT Alliance. Kate, did you hear that? Index on Censorship actually defending LGBT Alliance, with many detractors saying they were going to end their subscription to Index. That is quite a shift, and that has come about directly through pressure from me, primarily, but from all of us. So there are some positives, and going back to the funding issue. You know, when I started out in the arts, the worry was that the private funders, the philanthropists, would shape your programme and would bring their politics to the table. It's the other way around now. The fear is that it's the public funders that are shaping the programme, and that is happening. You know, that is definitely happening. But what's interesting to see as well is organisations like Wigmore Hall trying to build a way out of public funding. You know, so we are seeing shifting landscapes.
Okay, I'll take Lee out, and then I'll go back to the audience. So.
One thing that really struck me as people were making their comments is just the lack of funding and support within the sector for training development opportunities for cultural workers and spaces where these ideas can be really discussed and tested, and not just with individuals with the sector, not just sector talking to sector, but also, you know, for example, talking about the point you made around safeguarding, to bring in people with legal expertise, and just thinking it through a little bit more. I don't necessarily think a lot of people that work within the arts have a really rigorous training around safeguarding sometimes, and when that impacts on programming decisions, you can see things develop in ways that they really are really contentious and problematic. So I think there's just something about how do we support people that work in the cultural sector to think and to understand this really fast shifting landscape, and that's really important. I think also with the role of gatekeeping, we speak about these gatekeepers. We're kind of gatekeepers. I mean, I was certainly a gatekeeper as I programmed Tate Modern's largest public event. And I think there's a lot of discussions that go on around the audience and the audience we want to reach. And our public programme is about the audience. And I think audiences really shift and change and are quite complicated and quite surprising as people are. And that's a good thing. And we can kind of become a little bit stuck in our thinking about what audiences want. And it's always good to sort of test and learn. And to that point about testing and learning, we have to be safe, supported to sometimes fail. And then there's a wider question about how can we take risk when, again, that kind of financial underpinning is so fragile.
Okay, audience, there's a gentleman there, and can I see hands? Because I want to get you all in.
Hello, JJ Charlesworth, I'm an art critic. I think there's an important point that needs to be sort of drawn out about leadership. I think it's a very interesting point, and it's also very good to talk about history, because as Simon back there says, it's not just now, it's not like it's dropped out of the sky just now. This has been going on for 20 years, and I think 20 years
Speaking to the mic,
I think
JJ.
20 years is quite a good time frame to be working on this, because I think all of us have seen something change in 2 decades, that and leadership seems to have something about it. I think 20 years is a good point to start from, because it's when, say, BDS starts, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement begins. A few years later, Liberate Tate, the anti-oil sponsorship campaign group, starts to perform its actions. I think those two are very good prototypes and show the kind of historical scale and the drip aspect of this, which is that they started with what they thought were very clear, moral grounds for kind of campaigns which were not easily challengeable by everybody else, right? And the effects are present, right? The fact is that BDS has essentially excommunicated Israeli artists and artists from Israel from any program, contemporary art program in Britain in that intervening period. Liberate Tate started the ball rolling for campaigners thinking that they have the right to insist that their views about who should support culture should be the views of the leadership of the institutions that could support culture of every opinion and of every type, right? So leadership is an important issue, and I think it's not so much a failure of leadership, but a shift in the fact that leadership actually now sides with a particular view of culture which is political and politicized, right? So all the cases that we've heard and all the things that we tend to hear about, all the controversies that we tend to hear about in the arts, are to do with the fact that leadership thinks that it knows best, that it does not have the interests of a plurality of artistic practice at stake, and that it thinks of art and culture as politics by proxy. But it thinks of art and culture as a certain kind and a particular narrow set of agendas in politics and culture by proxy. So I think it's really important that, to pick up on Denise's point about pushing back and constantly coming back on this issue, that itself has that culture of leadership, advocacy, and so on, which has drifted into a kind of bias now, essentially, should be called out. It should be demanded that cultural organizations that have the public trust and the trust of public money should have a commitment to plurality in their agendas, in their programs, that may go against the things that they think, that they personally, within their personnel, within their leadership, within their management, think is best for culture and best for us. So I think that's the point about organizational values. It's not the value of an arts organization, a literary festival, a museum, a contemporary art center, whatever. The values that it should support is the values for artists to practice, right? And to practice as they see fit with some criteria of what makes it good or bad. That's the only gatekeeping choice that arts organizations have to make. Is it good or is it bad? What are the criteria? How do we establish them? The values they should not share or support is the values for parts of the public to insist and impose on everybody else what we should see, think, hear, and experience. So I think that's where we need to start being much more explicit about saying, and this is also about the private sector too, right?
Okay.
We have to be very clear that the private sector is as either kind of full of people who want to impose their positions and also very cowed by people outside of them. So it's easy to say the public sector, but the fact is that whenever Comedy Unleashed try to put on a gig, they can't find a booking, right? So the private sector is in as much trouble as the public sector.
Good point. There's a gentleman here, and yeah, we'll applaud that. J.J. Charlesworth speaking tomorrow on iconoclasm. Yes, him, and if you could pass it to him.
Let's keep it short. I mean, people are going on far too long. That's one of the problems. Seriously. Okay, Taylor Swift. Let's say she comes out as a Nazi. A sudden revelation. She starts singing some Nazi songs in her concerts, etc. Or, if you want to be a little less imaginative, she comes out pro-Israel, which is not going to happen. Or whatever, Taylor Swift or a star sort of equal to her, comes out and with some really weird views. Is there then a case for cancellation? I haven't heard anybody saying cancellation does have a role to play, you can argue. You could argue it. Panel.
Good question. If you pass it to the gentleman next to you, if we take you next, and then I've got you too.
Sorry.
Manik Govinda first, and then you go after him.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll try and keep it short. I'm Manik Govinda, arts curator and writer. Just wanted to quote, because recently, earlier this year...
Manik, I can't hear.
An Israeli choreographer called Ohad Naharin was cancelled by Ballet Island by people calling... the BDS campaign, very much kind of various offshoots from them. And he made a very good quote saying, if the act of cancellation would have helped the Palestinians' cause, I would boycott my own show. So, these kind of calls for boycotts, do they actually make a difference politically? Because what it seems to be is that these institutions, so in this case Ballet Island, did not protect or defend the choreographer they invited to create a piece for the company. They cancelled him. And what's that? What kind of victory is that? Because it doesn't do anything politically to change the situation. So would you say that boycotts are effective, apart from cancelling the artist?
Good question. Yes.
Sorry, yeah, no. A lot of different venues, I'm using venues in the broadest sense, and include television channels, it can include various art galleries and so on. A lot of these have, to a certain extent, always had, of course, a reason for existing and values of some type. So, like, people know what the brand of something is. But increasingly, as a lot of technologies have shifted and as people become more and more concentrated on this concept of branding and so on, there does seem to be this increasing expectation that everything within a certain experience stays the same and fits this sort of homogenous lens. But that's not how people live their own lives. I know there are people who like to sort of see everything across the board about their life as consistent. But I mean, I don't think that's how most people actually see the world and experience things. Like, I might, on the other hand, on one hand, care about animal welfare. I might also like futurist paintings, which are a total celebration of the machine or something like that. So, like, how does this concept of values fit in with the fact that people have plurality within themselves, and how does this relate to the commercial aspect where now everything has to be marketed in this way that is very cohesive and targeted towards very specific things and trying to be consistent in this way that was maybe not true in the past?
Useful question. There's a lady there, and can I see if anybody else wants to speak? Okay. We'll take her and then you, and then what I'll do is I'll come back to the panel for their final comments in the order they're speaking. The person is right there. Right there. Green. But we'll have the person behind first. So, yes. No, yeah, that's, sorry.
My question's prompted by what Liat started.
Can't hear.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. My question's prompted by what Liat opened with. You said that, of course, none of this applies within the private artistic sphere because that's where you develop your work and nobody's seeing it and so on. But is there a danger that the environment out there, seeing the sort of things we've been hearing about, would actually undermine that too and invade that by making people self-censor, rather in a manner of girls training hard for sports, seeing what awaits them out there and giving up?
Yeah. Thank you. Lady in green.
A lot has been said about values in the arts, and I think the worrying thing about values, of course, apart from the fact that everybody has different ones, is this idea that there are the right values. Now, we've heard that term already today, and it's actually quite a scary one. And I think when we're talking about the arts and artistic endeavour, and we talk about values that are not artistic values, the very term, the right values, should send shivers down our spine.
Yes, it's been a really thoughtful discussion. There's quite a lot on the table, and I think if I could ask the panel for their final comments on the way forward, like what's the most important thing to do to go out into the world and promote artistic freedom? Of course, if anybody does want to call for cancellation, as this gentleman has asked, is there a role for it? Please do. Absolutely. If anybody has it, you can talk to this lady afterwards. Okay, so panel, if you could go in the order that you spoke and give us your final comments. So what's the thing that you want to leave this room with people remembering in terms of how to campaign for and ensure artistic freedom in the future? Liat.
I do want to speak to your point about the defence of the cancellation. I mean, so let's just say Beyonce turns up as a neo-Nazi. Yeah. It would have to be an artist that I like. So, So, just for this thought exercise, the most contentious issue here today. My thought is that, it's an interesting one. I think it's up to the individual to cancel. So I certainly wouldn't then be going to gigs again, etc. Might express my views on social media. That's a different form of boycott cancellation rather than a sort of organisation or an institutional sense.
We don't. The question is, it's
a really good point, and it's one that is right at the core of artistic freedom, because obviously at Glastonbury this year, many artists took the stage and made comments about the current conflict, and some people were supporting it, some people weren't, but they do have the right to make that comment, and there is a line of offence as well, isn't there? But you could also argue that Beyonce might say that it was a comment, it was a subversion, she was making a point about there's reasons why artists in the role of the artistic form might put on that Nazi uniform. I don't think it's an easy one to tread, but I do believe in the freedom of artistic expression. But one artist said something. I did speak to an artist about this whole discussion around boycott, and they said something really interesting, which is it's such a dynamic thing. So let's just say in the example of, a high-profile artist wearing a Nazi uniform, there'd be a response, and there'd be a public debate, and it would be quite a dynamic process that would go on. And I think that's where it should sit with the audience.
Okay. Akil.
Well, I have particularly boycotted an artist, if I'm honest with you, because as a teenage boy, I went to watch the Smiths quite a bit. And I quite liked the Smiths at the time. And then Morrissey turned out to be a prat. And it's quite hard, actually, because I loved that music for many, many years. And I have that, and we have lots of arguments, me and my friends. We were all teenagers in Manchester, and Smiths were our band, and we loved them. And then, what can you do about Morrissey? He isn't a nice. He's turned out. He has views. I don't think I agree with any of his views, quite frankly. But the fact is, I think his views go to the point where I've decided to boycott him, and it's quite hard. But I'm quite happy now that Johnny Marr is singing some of those songs himself again now, so we could do it.
Okay, we've got to.
Anyway, but I think that's enough on boycotting of bands. I'd boycott many people, mainly because they're rubbish, quite frankly, rather than their particular views. But I think the one thing I think just the one particular point on leadership, I think it's quite important. I think we've talked a lot about leadership here, and I think there's a question as well about people and not standing by people, and I think that's quite important. And I think some of the people that may go on to be on board, I think I get asked to be on all sorts of boards. I sit on some boards, and I've been asked to be chair of a few arts organisations, etc. Who are the people that want to be on some of these boards? And who are some of the people that want to chair things, or who are the people that get chosen to be regional council chairs, etc., and all of those particular things? I'm going to be honest with you. A lot of the conversations that we've had today, I've had to make decisions, in my work. I had to make the decision: do we show the Charlie Hebdo cartoons or not? We did. We were the only broadcaster that did in the UK, and we had reasons for it, and we explained why we showed them, etc. So big decisions that we've had to make. Now, I can then be sat on a board, or I know some of these boards that exist. What big decisions have they had to make? Which particular division do we close down this quarter because they're not making a return? How does that make you the right person to be involved when things of this nature have to be debated, or do you go out and get the right kind of voice? So my point is actually that leadership, all of the particular things, whether it be leadership, vision, whatever you want to call it, actually is it fit for purpose? Are people fit for purpose? Do we know what's fit for purpose? Is the funding mechanism fit for purpose? Whether it be private or public, as I think the point that was made really well here, which is actually don't think the private is a panacea. It's the complete opposite, because actually then you have reputational damage for big organisations who will pull out at the very slightest hint of any kind of boycott or problem. They'll be out because they don't want their organisation to be linked to it as well. So all of this thing, I think, is really important. And if I'm the person that said something about right values, then I apologise. It was more to do with probably my terrible GCSE in English, B level, whatever, because actually I didn't mean it that right. There is no such thing as right values. I would agree with you. But having values, consistency, whatever it be, it goes back to that leadership thing. I think there is a crisis of leadership in many organisations, and I think what we've seen is that the people that may have made the great grand times in broadcasting, in the arts sector, etc., were probably because we had a lot of people who may have been the first in their family, generation in their family to go to university, because of passing 11 plus, going to university, having a different mentality to multi-generational, privately educated, liberal, middle class people who are running organisations and staffing it and stuffing it with people just like them. So then you don't have the opportunity to have a difference of opinion. So I think leadership and how we define what leadership is and understanding whether or not we have the right kind of leadership in arts organisations, that's what I think is really interesting, because good leadership will mean that you may not have the same level of, you may not have the same response to some of the boycotts and some of the conversations that exist at the moment.
Thank you. Denise, in the mic.
Yes. Yeah, I think if Taylor Swift did come out as a Nazi, and she did it privately at home, she could be left alone with that. But if she came out on a stage as a Nazi and spouted kind of violent, asked people to engage in violence, she'd be breaking the law. So we do already have laws to protect us against extremes. And I think the problem with... So yes, in that instance, I think she should be cancelled, yes. But the problem with using that example, that extreme example, is that we don't really tackle the problem that the gentleman at the back was talking about artists in their own studios self-censoring. And that is really, it's not the extremes that are the problem, really. It's the self-censorship in the sector that's even crept into the private space, even crept into the studio. And that's the hardest thing to kind of come out and to evidence and to, bring to public consciousness, because it's hidden. Art making is hidden anyway. So anyway, that's what we're looking to do in our organisation. We've got a survey out. It's live now. We've got a piece in the Times about it, publishing it next week. And we want to hear those stories so that we've got the evidence to prove that there is quiet and ongoing self-censorship in this country, and it's deadly for the arts. It will kill practice.
Johnny.
Fill it in.
Thanks. A lady on the front row has passed me her story, and I'll use that. I'll like to say what she's passed to me. She works in a public library, and her role involves arranging author talks, including the likes of Martina Cole. For 10 years, she was trusted to do this until she invited Simon Fanshawe to talk. Simon was one of the founders of Stonewall, and one of the first gay men, any sort of prominence, to speak out against sort of modern totalitarian trans activism in the direction of Stonewall. Go back to the lady on the front row. She was told by email to cancel Simon's booking, and is now required to have all potential speakers and authors authorized by the management team. She says, "This was a failure in the management team to defend the political neutrality of libraries and freedom of speech, the purpose of our library spaces as civic spaces." She asks, what can we do about this? Well, I mean, I hope that after today's discussion, there's some thoughts about what we can do about it. But just to say that this is exactly the kind of leadership failure that I've been talking about and that Keil was referring to, and we discussed. The preservation of the space, the artistic freedom is it's a space. It can shrink, it can grow, and it is under pressure from all directions and from all kinds of people, including audiences. Let's not forget, audiences can shrink the space for artistic expression too. A very old example would be Beshti, the play that Birmingham Rep tried to produce about 20 years ago, and Birmingham Rep capitulated shamefully to protests and cancelled the play. Not only that, but when they recruited a new artistic director, the job description included, and I'm paraphrasing from memory here, we're looking for someone who can demonstrate sensitivity to producing theatre in a multicultural community. There was absolutely sod all about artistic freedom in the job description. So that's how a sort of backing away from artistic freedom freedom ends up being codified in terms of diversity and EDI agendas. So there are so many ways in which artistic freedom can be shrunk. And if you're a leader in the arts, if you're a manager, a CEO, an artistic director on the board, your job is to advocate for that space for freedom for artists of all kinds and for audiences, and to accept that that means a collision of values. It means values will scratch up against each other. It is not, I really take issue with the idea that we should have values and work in alignment with them. No, we should accept that values will collide, and sometimes that can be messy. And if you're an arts leader, your job is to facilitate that. Your job is to stand there and take it and to enable that collision of values, even when it gets difficult.
Thank you. Josh?
Can I just...
No.
Yes, so cancelling is obviously a related issue, but it is slightly separate. I boycott certain products. I cancel them, like Body Shop, Innocent Smoothies, for various tweets and things that they put out in the whole turf wars, if you want to call it that. But then, of course, it goes down to quality of art. Roald Dahl, anti-Semite. I read his books to my kids, because they're really good. Then, of course, it comes down to whether they are using their platform to spread hate. And I don't want to be a hypocrite here, because there are former friends, colleagues of mine, comics, Reginald D. Hunter and Ishan Akbar and Dane Baptiste, all friends of mine previously, who turn out to be anti-Semites. Do I want them to never gig again? As someone who's been cancelled, I believe erroneously, and I believe they would believe that their thing is that they're not anti-Semites. But it's a really tricky discussion there. All I can do on my end is just call out what I see as their hate. I just want to say, in terms of finishing this all up as best I can, I'm optimistic, because going to Simon's point, the art limitations will always enhance art in whatever form those limitations come in terms of great art, it will. I think when it comes to what JJ was saying about public bodies, is there is a need for change for all, and this is a starting thing where this discussion is happening, it's already been happening, and that public bodies will have to take accountability for producing good art, and for what Johnny was saying in terms of, those leaders need to basically, man up, as he said. And in private things, you have things like Netflix, anything that can be quantified, they can see quite clearly where they've gone down certain routes to try and sell a message, and Disney will see that their shares go down, their viewership goes down, and there's already been a replacement there with bringing back the focus on being good storytelling. So the market, the private sphere, the public sphere, they will all intertwine. But what I will say is, so I'm positive, but that's not going to pay the bills in the meantime.
I don't think that's a call for funding, is it, Josh?
No.
Thank you very much to our panel. Let's give them a round of applause. Obviously, as Denise highlighted by wanting to come in at the end, this is not a discussion that is over or easily solved. What we're trying to do is open things up. We are now done. I'm being told to wrap up. This is a wrap up. I just have one announcement as you go on your way, which is to say, for those of you who are interested in meeting and signing the books of Andrew Gold, who Josh mentioned, but also David Goodhart, very interesting thinker. They are signing their books now. So go forth and buy their books and meet them and keep talking. Thank you very much.